All right, you've arrived at the last video for the September 7th class period. Uh, this is about sermon introductions. Paul Wilson mentions it in section 1, so I'm going to address it here. Don't have a lot to say, but some important things about sermon introductions. Part of the function of an introduction is to get people used to your voice and manner. So there's an extent to which introductory material is important for very practical reasons. Unless you're the regular preacher in a community, they need to get your accent, they need to get your rhythm, they need to get where your voice is pitched in the acoustic range. A lot of things are happening in the now. If you've been the liturgy leader, obviously they've already heard your voice, and so that function of the introduction is not as important. But just want to again, even if you are the regular preacher, some days you've got a cold, some days your throat is tight, and your voice is going to be a little different. So even with a regular preacher, it's helpful to have a little bit of introduction for purely acoustical reasons. That said, getting more toward the content aspect of the introduction, a sermon is not an essay. It used to be said when I was in school, in graduate school, that the introduction is the last thing you write. That should never be true of a sermon, because the introduction of the sermon is bridging from probably in most of our services from the Bible text and often the gospel reading, whether it's the Bible text or not, or whether it's the sermon text or not. The introduction is a bridge from what's happened before to where you want to take the sermon, and that will sometimes affect how you approach the introduction. So the introduction must account for the phenomenological reality of the moment. So pay attention to what's happened just before you get into the pulpit or get to your place in the worship space where you're going to preach. Also, the context of preaching includes the weather. So if it's storming and thundering and raining outside, that's a reality for your hearers. You cannot pretend that doesn't exist. People sitting and fiddling and babies crying and children fidgeting. All of those things are part of what the introduction is dealing. Well, of course, the whole sermon's dealing with it. It's part of what the introduction has to do is gather an audience at this point for moving into the sermon. So again, just pay attention to the phenomenology here. The most important thing I would say about sermon introductions is get to the heart of the matter as soon as you can. In classic rhetoric, classic writing, the Latin phrase is in media res. INMEDIA, media, and res, RES. Latin for get to the heart of it right now. The I don't remember I don't remember now if he mentions it in this edition of the book, but in the previous edition of the 4 pages, he talks about the step down introduction. That's probably the greatest crime committed during introductions, is that a preacher will start globally and then gradually whittle things down to where they finally get to what they want to talk about. We're 7 minutes into the sermon at this point, or 3 minutes into the sermon, doesn't matter, but already your listeners are wondering, what is this about? And they're trying to latch on to everything that's said. So again, think of your listeners. They want to know what this sermon is about. They came to church in part to hear the sermon. They are engaged. They are motivated. You can certainly lose their motivation, but you're not on a street corner trying to get people to listen to you. You don't need to be flashy or, vivid in that sense. You just need to attend to this group of people who want to know what it is that you've got to say, and what's the landscape, what's the area of where we're going today in this sermon, and you need to establish that as soon as possible. So, introductions should generally be less than a paragraph. In my opinion, once you've gone to paragraph number 2, if you're not already into the stuff of your sermon, then your introduction is going to fail to do its job, and you're going to lose some hearers. Stephen King, in his book On Writing, has a great thing about backstory. So oftentimes what preachers are doing in long-winded introductions is they're giving backstory. And he says, yes, backstory is important, but do it later. You don't have to do it at the beginning. You don't have to do it chronologically. You don't have to do it in the order that these things occurred to you. Once you know that this sermon is about this theme, this thing that God has done, go right there. Go right to it. And then if you need to say more about how you got to that place, do that later. Once they know what it's about, once they've got that information, the theme, the image, nestled into their medium-term memory, then you can talk about how you got there if you need to. But get right to the point. And we will talk more about this as we go. But the expectation of the audience, this is important. The expectation of the audience is that the first things you say are related to what the sermon is about. So if you throw them curveballs and talk, hey, isn't it a beautiful day out there today? Well, they think, unless they've gotten so used to your blathering, they think, okay, this sermon's going to be about the weather somehow, or about today's weather. But then you give them, you do a curveball, and you start talking about something else. And they, okay, that was just about the weather. This is what the sermon's about. And you develop that for a sentence or two. They're sort of, okay, the sermon's about this. And then you throw them a curveball and go to something else. How do they know when the time has come that this is what the sermon's about? So, again, introductions should quickly and obviously effectively move us from wherever we are in the liturgy, wherever we are in the world and in the weather and in the dynamics of the room, and say, here's what I'm going to talk about today. Here's what the sermon's about today. Not in that language, but and let's move into it. Let's go. So, in media res, again, is the Latin phrase. You may assume, I know it's not universally true, but it is safe to assume, in my estimation, that most people are looking forward to the sermon. If they're church-going people, and again, I know we're addressing a lot of different kinds of communities these days, but for most of us, we're addressing a community of people who are committed to each other at some level, and they've come to worship. It is safe to say that they are looking forward to your sermon. They want it to be a word of life. So the pressure in the introduction is not to create interest in your sermon. Again, that's street corner preaching. Yes, you've got to get their attention. You've got to, dazzle them somehow and get them to look at you. In a normal worshiping community, whether it's storefront or cathedral, they are looking at you. So your goal is not to lose the interest that they have shown. And the way you do that is to get right into the heart of the sermon, right into the thing. Especially when it comes to images and vivid language. If it's not integral to the sermon, don't start with it. Do not start a sermon with a joke. It's too vivid. It fills up that 12 seconds of present, and it does it vividly. So unless your image is coming from the joke, or your theme is coming from the joke, don't start with a joke. They're not here to laugh. They are here to hear a word of life. So same thing with a story. It was very common in preaching in the 60s and 70s to start with a story. Fine. But if the sermon image, the sermon theme doesn't come from that story, then you've filled your audience's short-term and medium-term memory with all kinds of vivid pictures and narratives that have nothing to do with the sermon. And where are they going to put the sermon when you finally get to it? They're all used up. Their medium-term memory is blocked. So again, stories are great, even jokes are great if they are germane to the sermon, if they contain vital information or images or language that the sermon is going to develop and use. So we'll have a chance to talk more about this, but that's what I want to say at this point about introductions.